Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us from wherever you may be. I acknowledge this is a webinar, but I would still like to acknowledge that for those who are tuning in from Australia, and I can see many of you are from Australia, we meet on Aboriginal land. We recognise the strength, resilience and capacity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Australia comprises many Aboriginal and Torres Strait nations, and I'd like to acknowledge all of the traditional custodians of the land within Australia. I pay respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait elders past and present. So my name is Ferdous. I'm a law graduate working for the law firm Ashurst and also a former US Consulate Youth Advisory Council alum. I also interned with the public affairs team in 2016, and I just liked some of the people in that team so much that I've kept in touch since then. And when they asked me to moderate today's panel, I was honored to do so as I'm deeply passionate about critical race theory, racial justice, and as is relevant to today's panel, the Black Lives Matter movement. So a little bit of a background to the Learn at Lunch series and a background to this webinar, in particular. So Americans from cities, towns and neighborhoods across the US have sought to take a stand against racism and racial injustice through protest. Drawing from fundamental freedoms of expression and assembly, their message of racial equality and racial justice has resonated around the world. This momentum has forced the world to confront systemic anti-Black racism that exists in countries, in industries and professions, and in homes. My hope is that everyone who's tuned in today will take insights from today and action items from the panel to your own homes, to your own neighborhoods, and to your own workplaces. A bit of background about this series as a whole. Before we shut down, before the pandemic, the US Consulate General Sydney held Learn at Lunches on various topics ranging from entrepreneurship to women's empowerment to political satire. This will be the third virtual Learn at Lunch, and I acknowledge it's a little bit later. If you're having your lunch now, that's not a good thing. And I thank you again for joining us this late. A quick shout out to the Ben Franklin Club. I know some of you have tuned in. The Ben Franklin Club is a youth networking group for students and young people interested in US politics and US affairs. It's also supported by the US Consulate General Sydney. And some housekeeping, you have probably already picked up on this, but all audience members are on mute. We will first go through some of my own questions, which are based on pre-submitted questions by the audience before turning over to the floor where you can ask questions live. I do encourage you to get involved and ask questions, but I ask that obviously you be respectful and please be concise in your questions and comments, unless your comment is to say that our panelists and moderator are amazing. They're allowed. If you have a question and want to speak when the time comes, just raise your hand using that tool and we will call on you. Or you can type your question into the chat box, which many of you have already used, or into the Q&A box. Before we properly start our Q&A, here is Donald Maynard, Head of Public Affairs, to say a few words.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Ferdous, and thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. I'm going to try to make this quick because I am not one of your panelists this evening. My name's Donald. I run public affairs at the U.S. Consulate General here in Sydney. Have been here for about 2.5 years. And one of the reasons I wanted to do an intro was just to set the scene as to why the United States Consulate would be hosting a conversation on race relations in the United States. Race, slavery has been referred to as the original sin of the United States. Race relations is something that we have struggled with from our colonial times to present. And it's something that I personally am a bit ashamed of, the way that our country has handled race relations over the years. It's also something I'm slightly proud of, is that as Dr. Martin Luther King said, the arc of history tends towards justice. And I hope that we continue to move in the right direction on race relations and improving the relations in the United States. And just to put a little bit of historical context, if I go back just within my lifetime to look at the differences, and I'm older than I guess probably most of the people that are listening in here today, if I go back through my lifetime, I see several instances where American citizens raising their voices have prompted change and change in the right direction. And I also see instances where there has been significant violence during the civil rights movement. And I hasten to point out that the majority of that violence was directed towards the minority community, those that were raising their voices. So if we look back to 1963, a year after I was born, a group of people in Birmingham, Alabama set a church on fire, a Baptist church on fire, and 4 young Black girls died in that church fire. In 1964, a year later, Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. In '65, we see Dr. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders marching from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, and Bloody Sunday happened. And that's when the marchers were stopped by state troopers. Several of them were beaten with sticks. One young man who was trying to protect his mother from being beaten was shot and killed. And just later that year, the Voting Rights Act was passed and signed into law. And in 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Just 8 days later, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act. I'm not trying to make a direct juxtaposition between those violent acts and the progress that was made, but I do point out that it's been the raising of voices against injustice that has prompted our union to strive to become what we say in our Constitution, a more perfect union. It took us a long time to talk bravely about what happened in '63, '65, and '68. But it took a long time before the State Department and we as government officials would come out and look at those moments in our history as positive moments, positive because of progress. And as I was reflecting with my colleagues over what we're seeing in America right now, we agreed that we hope that it won't take another 50 years before we talk about what's happening in America in 2020 as a positive example of American citizens raising their voices and fighting for change. So that's setting the scene for why we would do this. Now the legal disclaimer. I am the only one in this event who actually speaks for the United States government. All of our panelists are here in their private capacity. And they are not censored. What they say is their own personal opinion and does not directly reflect necessarily the views of the United States government. So if you want that, you got to come to me. And with all of that said, I will pass it back to Ferdous and enjoy the rest of the conversation. And I'd also like to thank Tyree, Ama, Cole, and Ferdous for volunteering your time to come out this evening or to stay home, but to virtually come out and join us this evening. And we're going to give each of the panelists a chance to give a little brief introduction of themselves. So Ferdous, back to you.
Thanks, Donald. Before we start our Q&A, could each of you, maybe starting with Cole, then Ama, then Tyree, just introduce yourselves to the audience?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Cole Brown. I was born in Fort Wayne and grew up in Philly, and only recently moved to Sydney in February, just in time to make it for the lockdown. I think I was asked to be here because, one, I recently wrote an article that appeared in the Sydney Morning Herald about watching these protests from abroad. I'm also the author of Gray Boy, Finding Blackness in a White World, which will be releasing in September.
Thanks, Cole. Ama?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ama Berkoh, 20 years old. I was born in Ghana and I grew up in Australia. And one thing I'm very passionate about is technology and ensuring that technology is inclusive for individuals that look like myself and for other underrepresented communities. I found that over the past few years, I wasn't able to properly navigate my footing in the tech industry, in the tech space. And now that I've become to understand what exactly I want and what exactly I'm passionate about, I really want to allow the opportunity for younger generations to be able to see themselves in these spaces and to acquire the skills to do anything which is like remotely possible to what they can.
That's awesome. And Tyree?
Thank you. My name is Tyree Barnette. I'm originally from Raleigh, North Carolina in the States. I moved to Sydney 7.5 years ago with my wife, who got a job in clinical research at the time. I myself am a careers advisor by day and also a writer. I write in collaboration with Sweatshop Writers Group. I've written several pieces for SBS Voices on race, vegan soul food, as well as being Black American in Australia. So I'm pleased to be here as part of the panel.
Thanks so much. I'm going to get stuck into it because we have quite a bit to cover. The reason why we're here today, I think, and why a lot of our audience has tuned in is because of the Black Lives Matter movement. No beating around the bush there. It's a movement that started in the US but has taken kind of the world by storm. And I have a few questions for each of you, but really drawing from this pre-submitted question, which was, what are the factors that contributed to the rapid internationalization of the Black Lives Matter movement? And I will, as I said, I will specifically ask each of you kind of questions to break down that broader question, because it is a very big question. So Ama, we might start with you. What are your thoughts on this as an African Australian woman, as a Ghanaian Australian woman? Does the Black Lives Matter movement resonate with you, even though it's regarded as, you know, originally a US kind of based movement?
I definitely think it resonates with me. I think time and time again, we always hear that racism is an issue exclusive to the United States of America. However, that is far from the truth. Australia is very much a country that was founded on racism. And I think, speaking directly to my experience as a Ghanaian Australian, we definitely resonate with with the current climate of racism in America. And we can resonate with the actions that have been pitted against a lot of Black Americans. And I speak to that. Growing up, when my parents initially migrated to Australia, they came to Australia to seek new opportunities, to seek new life. And within seeking a new life, I had to battle with the idea of belonging. I was pitted against my authentic identity and who Australia made me out to be, or who Australia needed me to be. So it's that idea that we have a shared experience and a shared history with Black Americans. And now that things have been globalized and internationalized, we have recognized our voice, and the years of suppressed trauma and pain that we're so accustomed to is no longer. We're now realizing that we have voices, and we need to utilize these voices because they've been put under the surface
for so long.
Yeah.
Thanks, Cole. You know, flowing on from that, and again, answering this big question about how this movement has become internationalized. In your recent article for SMH, The Pains of Beholding My Country from a Distance, you talk about how different your experience has been as an African American in Melbourne compared to your experience growing up in the US, and how I listened to an interview that you did recently with Richard Glover. You described that experience as disorienting and lovely at the same time. So tell us about this distinction in experiences.
Yeah, so in that interview with Richard Glover that you mentioned, I talk about some of the daily indignities, and in the article as well, I talk about some of the daily indignities that come with being Black in the States, and sort of things that might seem to some as minute as sort of a cab not stopping for you, or entering an elevator and someone clutching their bag. And I talk about sort of individually, these might seem inconsequential, but when combined, they form an experience that's oppressive and really weighs upon one. And in terms of the difference, I think that can be accounted in two ways. I think that one is history, and you're seeing us have sort of much more honest conversations these days about our history and how our history informs present day action and present day reality. So that's one. I think that's sort of a clear difference that we have in the States from the experience in Australia. But the other thing, and I think,
sorry to cut you short there, but do you mean it's different in that one of the countries is not as honest about its history, or?
I'm glad that you cut me off, because it's important to be clear about that. I think that you know, in the States we have several centuries of oppressive history against Black people explicitly, and then several decades of oppressive history against Black people implicitly, and still in some cases explicitly. In the States, we are incapable of recognizing how that history informs present day action. And I think that the difference between the States and Australia is not in our ability it was actually in both the history itself, the history against Black people, but then also in our ability to identify it. And that latter point, I think, is that this sort of myth of American exceptionalism that we have, that you know, one thing that I've been impressed about Australia and Australians is that there's a very global mindset here. One lives in Sydney, and even though it is geographically isolated, one's aware of one's surroundings and sort of the ongoings of the rest of the world. The American exceptionalism doesn't really allow for that. American exceptionalism doesn't allow for, you know, there's something almost, it is not particularly American to have a global mindset. I mean, I think that American exceptionalism prevents one from seeing the merit in other societies' ways of organizing themselves. And I think the danger there is that it prevents self-awareness. It prevents introspection. It prevents holding other societies as reference points. So when we look at sort of ourselves and pat ourselves on the back for the progress we made, you know, progress is a relative term. And so often we're comparing ourselves to former iterations of ourselves rather than sort of benchmarking across societies that are much better in grappling with their own oppressive histories.
Wow, that's really fascinating to me personally, because when I was studying critical race theory at Sydney Law School, all of the critical race theory theorists were from the US or from the UK. And if anything, I felt like Australia was behind on its kind of nuanced conversation. But I can also appreciate how that's like a very specific academic commentary, and what you're making commentary on is more kind of socially the reality in both of those countries. Tyree, you also, flowing on from that point, you have written similarly about your experience in Australia as compared to the US. And in an article that you wrote for SBS, you attributed this difference in experiences to this phrase that I find really fascinating. And that phrase is a hierarchy of Blackness that you think exists across nations, and why, you know, you're African American, and that second part of your descriptor is what gives you almost a currency above other Black people in this country, in Australia. Could you explain that concept of a hierarchy of Blackness, and why you think it's useful in understanding the Black Lives Matter movement and its international kind of presence?
Sure. Well, yes, unfortunately, I feel like African Americans in Australia particularly are seen as a point of fascination or a point of curiosity. I think this is because if you look at American culture and what proliferates across borders, African American culture is very much commercialized in Australia and all throughout the globe. You know, places where Black people, Black Americans have never stepped foot. They know hip hop, they know athletes, they know Kobe Bryant, they know, you know, clothing brands, they know, you know, all the beautiful creations that Black Americans have come out with. And so I think because of that, there is, you know, a fascination, a curiosity, a bit of a tokenism toward African Americans that other Black people from Africa or from Pacific Islands or, you know, wherever don't have, because of the just proliferation of our culture. And so I think that's important with understanding movements like Black Lives Matter, as well as movements that Black people across the world are struggling with for equal rights, is to understand that each population or each classification of Black, you know, is at, I guess, a different level in terms of attention paid to them, resources paid to them, voices either given to them or speaking for them. And so one person's struggle is not going to be the same from one community versus another one. And so I think when you look at Australia, Australia really needs to look within its own indigenous populations and the harm and, you know, the barbarism put upon them, and look at them as look at specific ways to address how to correct the wrongs of history, versus looking at America and saying, well, America's doing this for Black Americans, or Black Americans are doing this in America. You know, each situation is different based upon history, based upon attention given, and based upon, as you stated, a bit of cultural currency and what each subgroup is able to provide or kind of go off of based upon how society views them, and how society in some cases has consumed their own culture.
Yeah, in your article, actually, on that note, you mentioned how, I thought it was really eloquent the way you phrased this, that as compared to Indigenous Australians, while African Americans were ripped from their country, from their land, for Indigenous Australians, their land was ripped from them. And yet, yeah, they do identify with the Black Lives Matter movement.
Exactly. Yes. No. And there are, you know, if you go back and look at the history of indigenous activism and Black American activism, there are very similarities. You know, they had a Black Panther chapter here. They had freedom rides here, you know, with the indigenous communities. They took a lot of their, I guess, ideas or some of their ideas and some of their, I guess, points of inspiration, as well as either techniques or campaigns from the Black Civil Rights Movement.
Yeah, I might move on unless, did Ama or Cole, did you want to add anything to what Tyree just said? We did? Okay. So this was a pre-submitted question, and I will ask it, but I'll ask it in the context of kind of my own interest in and kind of advocacy for the Black Lives Matter movement. As a person of color, as a visible Muslim woman, I recognize how the Black Lives Matter movement is about Black people with a capital B, but people of color, irrespective of whether they're Black or not, still identify with it. They still find hope in it. And that's the context I'm giving you. And the question is, criticism of Occupy Wall Street was that it suffered from multiple messages. Is there a concern that the Black Lives Matter movement will face the same issues? And hopefully my context makes sense in the sense that there are so many things that the Black Lives Matter movement is now expected to kind of cover. It's become this kind of banner of just advocacy generally for marginalized people. Yeah, is the potential for different multiple messages a concern to you? What are your thoughts? Cole, I might start with you.
Yeah, so I have sort of two feelings on that. The first is that sort of divorced from principle, just almost as a strategic, pragmatic matter. I think Black Lives Matter as a rallying cry, as a mantra, is a beautiful thing and makes all the sense in the world. I think that you know, the way that we have been able to organize around that simple phrase that should in every corner of society be a given, but we see very publicly as not. I think that it's had a fantastic effect in sort of, you know, forcing these conversations to the forefront. Frankly, the fact that phrase is at all controversial speaks to the lack of progress in so many corners of our society. But to answer your question more directly in terms of the lack of focus, I think that what you're seeing, particularly recently, as we shift from just attempting to have a conversation in the public square to attempting to see real action, I think what you're seeing is both the pros and cons of a leaderless movement. Because I think that there is an issue when it comes to you know, we have cultivated and galvanized all this energy. Now it's time to direct it. And some of the, I mean, there are so many, like you said, there are so many initiatives that fall under the umbrella of Black Lives Matter. I do at times worry that we are extending ourselves so thin that when the dust settles, nothing will have gotten done. So I think that is one concern. And then also sort of on the leftmost edge of some of those initiatives, I have concerns there that people that are sort of in opposition to this movement and in opposition to the messaging that Black Lives Matter proliferates, that they harness those and use it as fodder for sort of just sensationalist outcries. You know, I'm thinking of the recent response to sort of the resistance against depicting Jesus as white, for instance. The way that has now usurped a position in the conversation around, oh my God, they're trying to tear down Jesus. You know, it's like it ends up being counterproductive when there are so many fronts that we're attempting to fight on. It ends up, I fear, sort of reducing the energy that's invested in any particular cause. Exactly.
Right. Tyree, Tyree or Ama, did you have thoughts on this? And I find that interesting, that yes, the Black Lives Matter movement is still regarded as controversial for some people who would rather say all lives matter. And I think that distinction is important in light of the fact that we think that the Black Lives Matter is encompassing so much that some people might say, oh, well, then it's all lives because it's covering so much. How is it still very much not an all lives matter movement and still Black Lives Matter? Is it because it's about minorities, and what is it that still keeps its distinction?
Well, I think if you look at the people that originally started the Black Lives Matter movement, being Black, queer American women, you know, who are already on the fringes of society, you know, in two ways, by being Black and by being queer. I don't think you can say the same thing for the Occupy Wall Street movement in terms of the founders or the originators of that movement. Were they marginalized people? Were they victimized people? You know, did they have, you know, one common rallying cry, like a simple phrase as Black Lives Matter, to unite them? So I think that because of the way the movement started, and with a very targeted group of marginalized people, and then growing that out to include other marginalized people, I think there is more of a focus. Of course, the umbrella has gotten bigger and included, you know, many other minority groups, but I think that that's also allowed these other minority groups to take on issues within their community and use, I guess, the model, as Cole said, of Black Lives Matter being a leaderless movement and really pushing Black Lives Matter to match their agenda for what they need for their own communities and their own, to get their own, you know, equal rights, civil rights. So I think because of that, the movement is a bit more versatile. And I don't think it's going to have the same kind of, I guess, die out that the Occupy Wall Street movement had. You know, when you look at kind of what they were doing, you know, camping outside, you know, in I guess, squares to raise awareness about, you know, corporate billions and overpaid CEOs. You know, how do you combat that from a tent? You know, or how do you combat that from the street level where they were? So I wonder if maybe from that movement, a lack of real, like, how do we carry this forward into policy versus Black Lives Matter? You're seeing policies change. You're seeing sports, you know, change. You're seeing corporations change their language. You're seeing even, you know, descriptions of real estate. No one's wanting, or less people are wanting to use terms like master bedroom. You know, these are small things that, of course, won't get us equal rights tomorrow, but there is kind of a groundswell of change that I don't know that you saw as much with Occupy Wall Street. I could be wrong, but I don't recall that, you know, that movement having such an impact, you know, when it was at its height.
Yeah, I'm conscious of the time and the fact that we do need to open up to the floor, but I did want to touch on this broad theme of, oh, sorry, did anyone want to, Cole, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, do you mind if I'm sort of, I might be taking your job for a minute, but I think that Tyree raised an interesting point, which is, Tyree, I'm curious about sort of the difference here between, you mentioned sports teams. I imagine you're thinking of the Redskins that are discussing changing their name right now, and some of the things that corporations have done. But I think that it's important to distinguish between that and policy changes. You know, I've seen Black Lives Matter get painted on a lot of streets. I'm not sure what that will mean in 5 years or 12 months from now. So I'm interested to hear sort of what you think, or Ama, in terms of the distinguishing between symbols that will, you know, that are ephemeral in nature.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing now with a lot of the symbolic actions that are occurring, it almost comes across as very performative. It's more in the time frame of the now rather than in the future. We're doing things to almost quiet, like the corporations are doing things to almost quiet us and to almost simmer down the sound now. I don't personally think that a lot of action that is being taken is with the intent of providing reparations or with the intent of providing any means of policy change, but I do hope that with the collective organization of Black people within both America and universally, we will begin to see a lot more weight on policies, a lot more weight on systemic change, a lot more weight within corporations and within other industries.
Yeah, look, all those are definitely valid points. You are seeing, in terms of the policy side, you are seeing cities like Minneapolis dissolving their police department and reforming their police department to be more, I guess, less predatory, more community-based. You are seeing cities like Camden, New Jersey, who actually has, I'm pretty sure it's Camden, who actually has already reformed their police departments to be less predatory, less aggressive, more community-based. You're seeing other cities look to that as a model in order to change their policing at the local level. You're seeing, I guess, at the national level, two versions of a bill that call upon police reform. You know, granted, not everything is in it that we'd like to be in it, but it is a start. These are things that, you know, 5 years ago, when you had Sandra Bland, when you had Tamir Rice, or you know, any other countless victims, these were things that were not on the table, that were not discussed, that, you know, politicians would kind of beat their chests about and they would go away. But now we're seeing, you know, real policy. And I take your points that some of it is symbolic, some of it is performative. You know, taking down Confederate monuments in the American South should have been done a long time ago. Talking about renaming military bases named after white supremacists or other buildings should have been done a long time ago. But you have to, you know, I feel like these sort of smaller policy changes can lead to discussions around, okay, now that we got that out of the way, the symbols change, now let's talk about the more substantive issues. So I think that, you know, we are seeing policy both at a local and federal level that we haven't seen to this point with this movement so far.
Thanks, guys. I think that's a really interesting point as well about statues and history. And I was going to talk about performative allyship, but I feel like Absolute Cole, you've done a great job. And you guys already discussed that. So thank you so much. But, you know, on this topic of statues and history, the US and Australia to a lesser extent, but certainly the US is in love with its history and historical figures. And, you know, Mount Rushmore is a testament to that. And Hamilton is a testament to that, and yet that a lot of that history is being criticized right now. A lot of history around the world is being criticized, and rightly so, in the UK as well, with statues being pulled down. In Australia, we've had similar conversations to a lesser extent. How do you reconcile that love for your country and its history, which is part of your country, with this criticism?
I think
question for me.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that I think that the issue that we're struggling with in the U.S. is an attempt to look at our own history through a nuanced lens, and I think again that sort of goes to exceptionalism and sort of our unwillingness to do so in the past, our insistence upon looking at our own history through rose-colored glasses. I am, and this is truly just my opinion, because I think that there is sort of a reasonable case to be made that we should kind of throw it all out. I think that Charles Blow recently made that case, I think, in the New York Times, and it's a reasonable case. I mean, you know, many of the people that created many, if not all of the people that created our nation were slave owners, and that's there's reason to criticize that. I look at it slightly differently. I think I have no issue throwing out everything that is the Confederacy. I have no issue with looking to our past and saying, you know, much of that memorialization happened in the era of Jim Crow, explicitly to intimidate the Black populations in these southern cities in the first place, and therefore all of that. I mean, we should feel, I think, a national shame about the fact that that this group at one point attempted to divide our nation in two. I feel differently about sort of our founding fathers. I think that we should take a more critical lens, a more critical look at the people that created our nation, and understand that our nation was born in sort of the blood and unwilling labor of Black people. But we can also take an additive lens rather than one that is strictly subtractive. So adding the Black narratives to our history and understanding how that contributed to who we are today, as well as Native American lenses and other peoples of color.
Yeah, definitely. Those are great points, Cole. You reminded me of a quote by an American scholar, E.S. Claude, who said that when people look at sort of the phrase political correctness, you know, and making sure that you don't say anything, you know, to offend anyone or say anything that could be, you know, taken to be, I guess, inappropriate or racist. What he introduced instead was a way of correcting history in terms of what political correctness meant. And, you know, to your point of history being made by slaveholders, being made by conquerors, being made by, you know, those who suppressed the voices of other minority groups, other indigenous groups that were part of that society. And so when you talk about correcting or fixing history, you have to bring, you know, more people who were around then, who are still around now, into reshaping that narrative of a country's history. You know, you look at the Confederate monuments in the US, a lot of them were built about a century ago. They weren't built right after the Civil War ended. They were built more to showcase dominance, to instill fear, and to instill ownership on Black people and minority groups that had to live in those communities. And I'll make one more quick point. If you look at works like the 1619 Project, which is done by Nicole Hannah-Jones, a journalist in the US, she actually looks at the history of Black Americans in the US from slavery all the way up to present, and identifies how our community has actually helped to further the US in terms of civil rights, healthcare, city planning, roads, et cetera, both, you know, from a positive and a negative standpoint, from the foundation of slavery, from the foundation of racism. And she makes the argument that African Americans are the most patriotic and, you know, the most lovers of the country the most, because they pushed it to become better and to live up to its ideals. So to answer your question, Firdaus, I think to show criticism and a critical lens and a prosecutorial lens on your home country or your native land is the ultimate act of love. If you didn't love it as much, you would just take it as is and not try to instill in it to be better or to do better or to be more.
Thank you so much. Ama, did you want to add anything in relation to that in the Australian context? Keeping in mind that, you know, when we go to primary school here, you're learning about Captain Cook. We don't really learn so much about how they treated Aboriginal Australians, certainly not in primary school, not so much in high school either.
Yeah, definitely not. I know that growing up, I was fortunate enough to definitely have that embedded within my curriculum, but I know that across Australia, a lot of schools did not have the opportunity to dig deep into the history of Australia and the stolen generation, etc. I definitely feel like it's necessary for us to really shed light on a lot of the issues that occur in Australia. We're so used to brushing it over. I hear time and time again, we almost pride ourselves in the idea that we're a very multicultural country. And I think at times that sort of negates the experiences of Indigenous Australians as well as Africans within Australia, because it tries to deflect what we experience and say things across the lines of go back to where you came from, or if you don't like it here, then deal with it, etc. So I think it's definitely, we need to do the internal work to figure out how we contribute to a lot of these biases and prejudices.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for your nuanced responses to that question. I think we'll take it live now. It is 6:12. I have overshot my aim of 6 p.m. but it was just too interesting. So yes, if anyone would like to come on and ask a question live, this will mean we will unmute you, and I believe you can also, oh yes, thank you, someone from the Sydney Public Affairs team who's typed this up. Yep, I will call on you, we will ask you to unmute your mic, and I believe there's the option to turn on video as well, if you're really brave. Okay, so we have one from anonymous attendee, and obviously I can't call on you. Okay. Okay, Stone, I think Stone might be your surname, but it comes up as Stone Guy. Guy Stone, you had a question about colonialism and capitalism. Okay, Guy, you're not there. That's okay. I will read out your question. But yeah, we'd love for this to be, oh, actually, sorry, Guy, somebody has their hand up. Oh, Guy Stone. Yes, great. Okay, can we unmute Guy, please? And Guy, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, awesome. So I made a few comments about economics because when we look at history, racism has everything to do with economics. Otherwise, colonialism would not work. They couldn't take over a land. They couldn't subjugate a people because they wanted to take care of take over the resources. So if we look at the American Indian experience or any indigenous experience, they didn't get together. They didn't organize themselves, and also they were prevented from doing so. So the question I'm always asking is, what is it going to take for African Americans to actually collectively work together and create their own economies? For instance, most cities you go to, there's always a Chinatown, but you don't see that. You don't see that with African Americans, and I would dare say that with other minorities, that's not always the case. So the question again is, what do we do to get together so that we can transform this? Because I don't see any way forward after 600 years of colonialism that we can beg for it. We have to do it ourselves.
Thanks, Guy. So yeah, over to.
Can I? Yeah, I have a response to that, and Tyree, it looks like you do as well. My response to that is I think that, and I saw that there was a question submitted earlier around even a black state, which would go even one step further. And I think that there are sort of pragmatic challenges to that, and also principal challenges to that. So I think that pragmatically, in an economy sort of that is global in nature, such as the one that we exist in today, this is more towards sort of the black state question that I saw submitted. I think that it's sort of totally impractical. But the more important challenge to that is the principle one, and sort of the challenge on principle is that the U.S. is a black state. I mean, the U.S. is a black economy. We built it, damn it. And for that reason, I think that any expectation that we should need to secede from it in order to achieve prosperity is one that is deeply flawed. I mean, it's a deeply flawed premise. I think that we are entitled to every bit of its spoils. The reason that we don't have sort of communities such as the Chinatown is because Chinatowns are sort of immigrant communities. We are not immigrants. We are that America for generations is all that we've known. So I think that any sort of economic prosperity that America has achieved has come oftentimes at the expense of Black life and Black bodies. And our goal should not be to sort of shy away from that prosperity in order to carve out once again some of our own, but instead to redistribute and reclaim that which is rightfully ours.
Yeah, I think also to further Cole's points, we have had in the past, these Black business enclaves, neighborhoods that were burned, that were destroyed, that were, systematically starved out, had highways built through them, so it has, in terms of localized communities, having a Black business side of town, that has been attempted, and it is still going on to some extent. The other issue you have with that, and not saying it can't be done, is of course gentrification. Whenever you have a Black enclave, and you see it out here in Sydney as well, or a minority, predominant area that is attractive because of its location, or attractive because of the cheap land. You have all these external forces working against it, so that they're often toppled before they even can really reach full strength. Another note, though, there has been, I guess, since the latest iteration of police brutality, there has been more online presence here in Sydney, especially, and throughout other states and territories, of Facebook groups where there are collections of Black businesses, either Indigenous owned, African owned, African American owned, or what have you, that people have gone to, posted what kind of business they operate or what they can do to attract and to inform potential customers. So there is some of that going on. It may look different in a virtual space, but it's not something we've ever given up on. And I definitely agree with all of Cole's points on that. America is a Black state, and I don't think that I think to walk away from something we built is would be the ultimate insult to our community in terms of what we've done for the country and continue to do for the country.
Thanks both. I'm conscious that not many people are raising their hand, but we do have a few questions coming through the Q&A box. So I'm going to be asking them. There might not be a beautiful flow between questions because they are very varied. They are very interesting questions though. So this one's to Ama. What's on your mind right now regarding how technology plays a part in the Black Lives Matter movement? I think that is really, really interesting in light of the fact that civil rights and the Black Lives Matter movement has technically been around for a very long time, but there are some things, obviously, with technological advances that now bring it to the fore.
I worry specifically about the many instances of racial bias that we see in artificial intelligence and through machine learning. I worry that if we don't change the makeup of a lot of these companies and a lot of these industries, we're going to see a lot more racism in the products that we use. And for me, technology has become almost an extension of myself. It's in the things that I do when I work, in my life, in my everyday life. So the last thing that we need to see is technology perpetuating the same actions that humans are so prone to perpetuating. And at the end of the day, if we really think about it, as humans, we're the ones that are inputting code into a lot of these devices. So I think the first and foremost thing that we need to work to do is to ensure that we build a lot more inclusive products by doing internal audits with our products. I find that when you look at the user experience design process, a lot of companies, specifically the big tech companies, although they're taking strides to improving how diverse their companies are, there's still a lot more improvement. They need to essentially create systems where there's a diverse slate of employees, and that's not just a matter of ticking the box of, yes, we have a head of inclusion, of diversity. We really need to look at overall, like the overall makeup of the company, to ensure that every person is heard, seen, and included. For me, diversity is not just the mere action of one head of the leader of a company, but it includes ensuring that the items that you produce and the items that you make are reflective of the diverse world in which we live in. And I think that's crucial. And in taking away tangible solutions, I think first and foremost, we need to build a school to tech pipeline that encourages students to really immerse themselves within the technology industry. Something that I lacked growing up was representation. I didn't see individuals that looked like myself within the tech industry, and that was automatically a deterrent for me to enter into the industry. So I think that first and foremost is crucial. Secondly, I think we need to work on creating a lot more diverse programs within companies. So that is checking out unconscious biases and ensuring that we don't contribute to a lot of the issues that we see. And thirdly is ensuring that our products are diverse. If you look back at history, a lot of items as simple as like human sanitation products, automatic dispensers, they weren't able to detect individuals as dark as myself. So we need to work to ensure that we don't continue to see technology perpetuate a lot of racial ideologies.
Absolutely. This seems to go back to our earlier discussion, but obviously elaborating on that discussion about allyship and specifically corporations and that kind of allyship. So Tyree and Cole, I'm curious, you know, flowing on from Ama's points about how corporations can be more inclusive, you know, diversity and inclusion is a phrase that's thrown around everywhere. Almost every big corporation has a diversity and inclusion head of some kind. What does that mean for you in your respective industries or professions that you've engaged with? What is it that's lacking? Is it leadership? Is it grassroots movements? How can we have a meaningful kind of diversity and inclusion initiative in corporations?
Tyree, you're an entrepreneur. I'll let you go first.
I think for, I guess for my work as a careers advisor, and I guess looking more broadly at corporations that we work with to employ students, I think one of the more successful programs would be internships, or drawing what Ama was saying, starting early, you know, if you notice there's a lack of Black females in tech or immigrants in tech or what have you, you know, what you need to do is invest both immediately and in the long term. So, you know, of course, internships, programs, et cetera, for students that are studying, that are coming out of uni, but then also looking further back and going into grade school, going into secondary school, having programs that add to the curriculum that those students are learning, you know, to get them interested early on in those sorts of tech fields or areas where representation is lacking. And honestly, yes, if you do have at least one person of color or someone, you know, that can speak to that population that they'll identify with, yes, sending them out, you know, sending your token out in this case, unfortunately, in the hopes that you attract more people. But I think that early investment, that being consistent, and also starting, I guess, locally with the schools around you, with community around you, can help build something bigger. You know, once you get a couple of students or a couple of graduates or professionals in, they can attract more people, so their friends, family, cousins, etc., classmates, former schools, you know. But you have to build that pipeline, and you have to put, like I said, both the long and the short-term investment in to make sure that in a few years' time, your company photo is more diverse than it is currently.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. What Tyree described is sort of a bottom-up model, and it's interesting because I actually often think of it in reverse fashion. I often think of it in sort of a top-down model. I often think about sort of diversity starting at the top and starting at sort of decision makers at the top of these organizations, prioritizing it the same way they would any other business concern. So that's you know, ensuring that there are diverse people in the room, so to speak, sort of, you know, in the executive suite, and we've seen many of these challenges around challenges to Nike and so forth, other companies where they're not having any Black voices in the C-suite. I mean, I think it's impossible to expect that they, particularly a company like Nike, that would prioritize Black issues without Black people in positions of power. So that's really where I think this begins. I think that we need to see sort of career development in diverse perspectives of promise in sort of mid-level in these organizations to ensure that can rise to the top and then reprioritize on its way down.
Great, and Ama, you've obviously answered the questions from the beginning. Thank you. I'm conscious of the time, and we will be wrapping up soon. Just one final kind of piece of homework that I'd love for you guys to give our audience. On an individual level, what should people be going away and doing? Who should they be reading? For someone who wants to play a role and wants to do something in the Black Lives Matter movement, where do they begin? And does it matter if they are Black or a person of color or not? Where do people begin to kind of advocate for change? I might start with, because I'm conscious of, I might start with Ama on this.
Yeah, of course. I think I'm always very, like, I'm number one on doing the internal work first before you even look to reaching out sources of books or movies. I think a lot of people aren't able to realize their own personal privilege. So I think if you sit down and have these conversations with your Black friends and really understand where they're coming from and their own personal experiences, you'll almost uncover a lot of instances where you contributed to the trauma that they experienced. So in taking that, that's when you're able to read a lot more books, watch more movies that present the plight of Black Americans and Black people universally, and also to, at times, maybe consider supplementing active forms of engagement and going for the passive. So following activists, advocates, businesses, and really understanding what they do on a day-to-day life.
Yeah, I'm really curious about that point on like less talking, more listening. Cole, Tyree, do you have any takeaways for our audience? What can they do to start the conversation at home, in their neighborhoods, and at work?
I totally agree with what Amma said. I think it starts with the self. I will say that I appear to be a lot of people's Black friend, because I had like a bunch of people reach out to me about Black issues. I'm not always in the mood to break it down. So in terms of sort of reading where to begin and movies and so forth, I think that every website on the internet has sort of its list, and there's, you know, there's a few sources that everybody should read, I think, and those are easily accessible. I think that sort of self-work needs to be done in terms of questioning one's narrative, questioning what we take for granted, questioning the history that we've been fed, before we can honestly confront and cause change going forward.
Yeah, I think I agree with both points made by Ama and Cole. I think people have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think if you look at your circle of friends and you don't have anyone of color, you know, they all look the same, they all have the same opinions, that's probably a good place to start. If you watch television or read books and the people look like you that have opinions that you share, or, you know, where you shop or where you live or places you go, if there's no diversity, you know, is that because it's purposeful? Is that something that you intentionally set out to do? Or has that always been your environment? And so start to, like it was already said, do a lot of the internal work on, you know, what's your daily life look like? And how many times do you have to come across people that look different than you, people that have different opinions than you, or people that are from different backgrounds, whether it be racially, socioeconomically than yourself, et cetera. And then where Cole said about being a whole host of tools online, you know, for me, it just starts just reading the news, you know, start reading about what's going on with indigenous communities, try to listen to Corey Radio, or try to watch, you know, NITV or really any other source of news from a minority perspective, and get outside of your own bubble. And don't expect people of color to explain their problems to you. You know, in the information age, there's more than enough information out there so that you're not having to continuously go to your Black friend Cole or your Black friend Ama and exhaust them, you know, with your questions and things that are readily available on Google. So yeah, do self work and start to reframe, I guess, your viewpoint and where you consume or where you get information and news about current events or things going on around you.
Amazing, thank you so much. I think that's a really powerful note to end on as well. I'm conscious of the time and I would like to wrap up. I'd like to first thank our incredible panelists for their time and both their intellectual and emotional energy, which is required for conversations like this. It is no easy task, as we just discussed. Really, really appreciate that. I would like to also thank our wonderful audience for joining us and for their pre-submitted and live questions, which help to make conversations like this meaningful. I hope you all go away with a clearer sense of your role in this conversation about racial justice. And I would of course like to thank the Consulate for hosting this frank and honest conversation about race relations and racial justice in the US and Australia. Finally, I'd like to remind the audience to sign up for the Consulate's next Learn at Lunch on human space exploration with former NASA astronaut, Dr. Mary Ellen Weber on July 21st. The registration link will be in the survey that pops up when you exit the webinar. On that note, it is 6:30. It's a little bit past 6:30. Thank you guys so much for your time and have a lovely evening. Thanks guys. Thanks Tyree, Ama and Cole. Thank you.
Thank you all.